Call her now.
The prison gate slid open with a metallic scream, and Daniel Cross stepped into the light as a free man after 5 years, locked away for a crime he did not commit. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't cry. He simply turned to the officer beside him and said, calmly, almost coldly, "Call her now." The woman who once slept beside him. The woman who smiled in court while he was sentenced. The woman who framed him and walked away with his life in her hands. No one knew what Daniel knew at that moment. Not the guards, not the lawyers, and certainly not his wife, because this wasn't just a story about prison. It was a story about betrayal, so precise it looked like justice, and truth, buried so deep it nearly stayed dead. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. And if you're ready for a story like this, don't forget to subscribe. The morning Daniel Cross was arrested, the sun was shining too brightly for something so wrong to happen. It cut through the living room windows in clean, golden lines, illuminating the framed wedding photo on the wall. Two smiling faces frozen in a moment that now felt like a cruel joke. Daniel stood in the center of the room, barefoot, hands shaking, as 3 uniformed officers read his rights with mechanical indifference. Their voices blended into a dull hum, like background noise to a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Laura stood behind them, wrapped in a soft cardigan, her arms folded tightly around herself. Her face was pale, eyes glassy with tears. She looked exactly how a betrayed wife was supposed to look. That was the first thing Daniel noticed, even before the handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. She wasn't panicking, she wasn't confused. She was performing. "Daniel, please," she whispered, her voice cracking at precisely the right moment. Just tell them the truth." He turned to her, searching her face for fear, for doubt, for anything real. "I am," he said. His voice came out hoarse. "You know I am." She flinched, as if struck. One of the officers gently moved her aside, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. In that instant, Daniel felt something rupture inside him. Not anger yet, not even fear, but a hollow disbelief so deep it stole the air from his lungs. The world had already decided who he was. The charges sounded unreal when spoken out loud. Financial fraud, evidence tampering, a crime intricate enough to require planning, malice, and motive, none of which belonged to him. Yet every document they showed him carried his signature. Every transaction traced back to accounts in his name. Every witness statement painted him as unstable, controlling, dangerous, including Laura's. She told them about his mood swings, about the nights he came home silent and distant, about the arguments that left her shaking in the bathroom. She never lied outright. She didn't have to. She simply arranged the truth into a shape that strangled him. Daniel had always believed love was built on knowing someone completely. He had known Laura for 12 years. He knew how she took her coffee, how she slept curled toward the edge of the bed, how she hated thunderstorms but loved the smell after rain. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was how easily she could erase him. The trial moved fast, too fast. His lawyer spoke in careful, cautious sentences, always one step behind the prosecution. Evidence stacked up like a wall closing in. Emails he didn't remember writing. Contracts he had never seen. Surveillance footage that placed him in the wrong place at the wrong time. Each day in court felt like watching his own funeral through bulletproof glass. Laura took the stand on the 3rd day. She wore a simple navy dress. No jewelry, her hair was pulled back, exposing her neck, making her look fragile. When she spoke, her hands trembled. When she cried, she covered her face. As if ashamed of her pain, the jury watched her with sympathy, with outrage on her behalf. Daniel watched her with a growing, sick realization. She knew exactly what she was doing. When the verdict was read, there was a sharp ringing in his ears. Like the aftermath of an explosion, guilty on all counts. The judge's voice faded as the sentence was delivered. 5 years. 5 years stolen from his life. handed over to a lie dressed up as a wife. Laura didn't look at him as they led him away. Not once. Prison stripped Daniel down to his barest form. No name, just a number. No past, just survival. The first weeks were a blur of noise and tension, of learning when to speak and when to stay invisible. He replayed the trial in his mind every night, searching for the moment he should have seen it coming. The glance she avoided, the questions she never answered, the way she had insisted on handling the finances to help him relax. Regret was a slow poison. It didn't kill him quickly. It seeped in, day by day, until it threatened to hollow him out completely, but something else grew alongside it. Clarity. With nothing but time, Daniel began to notice patterns. The evidence all flowed through Laura before it reached the court. The accounts were opened with his credentials, but her devices. The witnesses were people she had spoken to privately first. Even the timeline of events matched her schedule, not his. It wasn't sloppy. It was elegant. And that, more than anything, terrified him. Because elegance meant intent. Outside, Laura thrived. Daniel learned that through scraps of conversation, a newspaper left on a bench, a careless comment from a guard. She sold the house within months, started a business, appeared at charity events, smiling beside influential people. She was the resilient woman who survived a monster. The narrative was perfect. Inside, Daniel learned patience. He stopped trying to convince anyone of his innocence. He listened instead, watched, stored every detail away. He helped where he could, kept his head down, earned a reputation for being calm, reliable. It wasn't an act, it was necessity. Rage would have destroyed him. Hope, carefully controlled, kept him alive. 5 years later, when the gates finally opened, Daniel stepped out thinner, quieter, but unbroken. The world smelled different, sharper, realer. An officer handed him his belongings, wallet, keys, a phone that felt foreign in his hand. "Good luck," the man said, already turning away. Daniel didn't move. He stared ahead, eyes steady, heart slow. Then he looked at the phone and spoke the words that had been waiting patiently for years. Call her now, because Laura thought the story was over, and Daniel was finally ready to tell the rest of it. The phone rang only twice before she answered. "Daniel." Laura's voice slipped through the speaker, smooth and controlled, carrying just enough surprise to sound believable. I heard you were released. I was going to call." Daniel said nothing. He stood just outside the prison gates, the concrete still warm beneath his feet, the sky too wide to take in all at once. 5 years had taught him the power of silence. He let it stretch. "Daniel." She tried again. Softer now. "Are you okay?" "I am," he said finally. His voice startled even him. It was steady, clear. Nothing like the broken man she remembered leaving behind in a courtroom. "I just wanted to hear your voice." There was a pause. A fractional one. The kind most people would miss. Daniel didn't. He heard calculation flicker to life on the other end of the line. "That's unexpected," she replied. "After everything?" "Yes," he said. "After everything?" She exhaled. A practiced sigh. "I hope you know I never wanted things to end this way." Daniel almost smiled. They spoke for less than 2 minutes. She offered condolences for the lost years, careful never to say the word innocent. He thanked her for answering. When the call ended, Daniel slipped the phone back into his pocket and started walking. Freedom felt less like relief and more like standing at the edge of a cliff. Exhilarating, terrifying. There was no one waiting for him, no family waving, no friends clapping him on the back. Those connections had eroded quietly. While he was locked away, people choosing distance over discomfort. He didn't blame them. Laura had made sure the story left no room for doubt. He took a bus into the city, watching familiar streets pass by like scenes from a life that belonged to someone else. Buildings had changed. Stores he remembered were gone, replaced by newer, brighter versions of the same emptiness. The city had moved on without him. Laura had too. Daniel checked into a cheap motel, on the edge of downtown, the kind of place that didn't ask questions. The room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet. It was perfect, anonymous, safe. He sat on the bed and let the silence settle around him. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he unpacked the years. In prison, memory had been his enemy. Now, it became his weapon. He pulled each moment apart carefully, examining it with the patience he'd learned inside. Laura insisting on handling their joint accounts. Laura encouraging him to sign documents late at night when he was exhausted. Laura suggesting he step back from certain friendships because they were toxic. Each memory, once harmless, now revealed its sharp edges. By morning, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Laura had never acted alone. There was too much reach, too many systems bent perfectly into place. She had help, someone with legal knowledge, someone who knew how to make lies look like evidence. Daniel showered, dressed in the same plain clothes he'd worn upon release, and stepped back into the city. His first stop wasn't a lawyer, not yet. Lawyers required money, and money required leverage. Instead, he went somewhere far less official, a public library. He spent hours there, hunched over a computer, reacquainting himself with the digital world. He searched quietly, methodically. Laura's name appeared everywhere now. Business registrations, board memberships, media mentions praising her resilience. She had turned her narrative into a brand, but brands left trails. He found a small consulting firm tied to her new company, registered 2 months before his arrest. The address led to a law office. One partner's name made Daniel's pulse quicken. He remembered it from the trial spoken once, almost in passing, when a piece of evidence was introduced. At the time, it meant nothing. Now, it felt like a door cracking open. He printed what he could, careful not to draw attention, and slipped the papers into a folder. By late afternoon, exhaustion hit him hard. His body was free, but it hadn't forgotten years of concrete floors and scheduled movements. Back at the motel, his phone buzzed. A message from Laura. "I've been thinking about you. If you want to talk, maybe we could meet." For closure. Daniel stared at the screen for a long time. Closure. The word tasted bitter. For her, it meant sealing the past, smoothing the edges of guilt. For him, it meant something else entirely. He typed back slowly. "Maybe, I'll let you know." The reply came almost instantly. "Take your time, I want what's best for you." He turned the phone face down. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet preparation. Daniel reconnected with one person from his past, a former co-worker who owed him a favor and asked no questions. Through him, Daniel gained access to old internal emails, archived logs that had never made it into court. Patterns emerged. Not proof yet, but direction. At night, he dreamed of the courtroom, Laura's voice echoing, the gavel striking like a gunshot. He woke each time before the verdict, heart racing, reminding himself he was no longer trapped in that moment. On the fourth day, he made his move. He called Laura. She suggested a cafe downtown, bright and open, all glass and sunlight. A place where she could control the optics, Daniel agreed. When he arrived, she was already there, seated near the window. She looked exactly as she had on the stand years ago, composed, elegant, unbreakable. Her eyes widened when she saw him, then softened into something that resembled regret. "Daniel," she said, standing. "You look different. So do you," he replied. They sat. Small talk filled the space between them, light and careful. She spoke about her work, about healing, about moving forward. She avoided the past unless he nudged it gently, always steering the conversation back to safety. Finally, she reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. "I'm glad you're free," she said quietly. Daniel met her gaze, searching for any trace of the woman he thought he loved. "I am too," he said. "Especially now that I see the whole picture." Her smile faltered, just for a second, he noticed. And for the first time since walking out of prison, Daniel allowed himself to believe that justice, real justice, was finally within reach. Laura recovered quickly. Whatever flicker of unease crossed her face vanished behind a smile that had been practiced for years. The whole picture, she repeated lightly, tilting her head. I'm not sure what you mean. Daniel leaned back in his chair, letting the cafe's noise wash over them. The hiss of the espresso machine, the low murmur of conversations, the clink of cups. Public places had rules. Laura felt safest where scenes couldn't be made. That's okay, he said. You don't have to explain it to me. Her fingers tightened around her cup. Daniel, I know things ended badly, but I really do want you to heal. Carrying resentment only hurts you. There it was, the gentle moral high ground, the suggestion that his pain was a choice. He nodded slowly. You always were good at advice. They finished their drinks without incident. When they stood to leave, Laura hugged him briefly, her perfume familiar and unsettling. If you need anything, she said softly, you know how to reach me. Daniel watched her walk away, confident, unhurried. To anyone else, it would have looked like two people closing a painful chapter. To him, it looked like a chessboard after the first move. That night, he spread his documents across the motel bed. The consulting firm, the law office, the timeline. He traced it all again, confirming what his instincts already screamed. Laura hadn't just framed him. She had engineered a narrative so airtight that the truth had no oxygen left. What haunted him most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was how patiently she'd done it. The next lead came from an unexpected place. 2 days later, his former co-worker called, voice low. I found something weird, he said. Old audit logs. They were flagged, but someone higher up shut it down. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. Who? Can't prove it yet, but the signature approving the override belongs to a consultant. Same firm you asked about. Daniel closed his eyes. Pieces clicked together with brutal clarity. The firm hadn't just advised Laura. They'd cleaned her tracks. That night, he made another call. This one, to a public defender's office across town. He didn't introduce himself as a victim. He introduced himself as a problem. I was wrongfully convicted, he said calmly. And I can show you how the system was manipulated. There was a pause. Then a measured response. We get calls like this every day. I know, Daniel said. That's why I waited until I had something different. They agreed to meet. The attorney assigned to him was younger than he expected, sharp-eyed, cautious. She listened without interrupting as Daniel laid out the story, sliding documents across the table one by one. She asked precise questions. Dates, names, motives. When he finished, she sat back, silent for a long moment. This doesn't prove innocence, she said finally. Not yet, Daniel met her gaze. But it proves interference. Yes, she admitted. And that's enough to start asking questions. For the first time in years, the weight on his chest shifted, not gone, but redistributed. He wasn't shouting into the void anymore. Someone was listening. Word travels fast in small circles. Laura sensed it before anyone told her. Her calls went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. A board member asked a pointed question about compliance she hadn't prepared for. She called Daniel that evening. You've been busy, she said, skipping pleasantries. So have you, he replied. Her voice hardened. What are you trying to do? Understand, he said. The same thing I wanted in court. You're playing a dangerous game, she warned. People won't thank you for reopening old wounds. Daniel smiled to himself. I'm not doing this for thanks. Silence stretched between them, heavier than before. You should move on, Laura said finally. We both should. I did, Daniel said. The day I walked out of that gate, he hung up before she could respond. The following weeks unfolded like controlled chaos. Subpoenas, quiet inquiries, a journalist reaching out for comment. Laura's carefully built image began to crack at the edges, not shattered, but chipped, enough for light to get in. Daniel stayed in the background, exactly where she couldn't reach him. He kept notes, attended meetings, answered questions. He didn't seek revenge. He sought alignment between facts and truth. One evening, as he walked back to the motel, he passed the courthouse. He stopped across the street, staring up at the stone facade. For years, it had represented the place where he was erased. Now, it looked different. Less monolithic, more human, fallible. He understood something then that prison had taught him well. Justice wasn't a moment. It was a process. Slow, unforgiving, and often painful. Laura would fight. He knew that. She always did. But for the first time, Daniel wasn't alone on the other side of the board, and that changed everything. The first official letter arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped under the door of Laura's office, before most of her staff had even arrived. She read it standing up, her manicured fingers tightening on the page as her eyes scanned the formal language. A request for documents, framed politely, backed by authority, the kind of letter that didn't accuse but didn't need to. By noon, she was on the phone with her attorney. "This is nothing," she said, pacing behind her desk. "A routine inquiry. We comply. It goes away." Her attorney didn't answer right away. That pause told her more than his eventual words. "We'll cooperate," he said carefully, "but you need to be very precise. No improvising." Laura hung up and stared at her reflection in the glass wall. For years, she had controlled every narrative she touched. She had learned early that truth was less powerful than consistency. As long as a story never wavered, people stopped questioning it. But Daniel had returned with something she hadn't planned for: patience. Across the city, Daniel sat in a quiet conference room with the public defender and an investigator who barely spoke, preferring to listen. On the table between them lay a growing stack of files, bank transfers, metadata, consulting invoices that didn't quite align. "This doesn't look like sloppiness," the investigator finally said. "It looks like choreography." Daniel nodded. "She never leaves fingerprints. She leaves habits." They focused on those habits. Repeated patterns of communication. Meetings scheduled just before key evidence surfaced. Payments routed through intermediaries who vanished after serving their purpose. Nothing illegal on its own. Together, they formed a map. The first real breakthrough came when they subpoenaed an old email server from the consulting firm. The firm claimed the data was lost, backups corrupted, unrecoverable. The investigator smiled thinly when he heard that. "People delete files," he said. "They don't delete shadows." A week later, a technician recovered fragments, partial messages, timestamps, routing paths, enough to establish that Laura had been coordinating with legal consultants months before Daniel's arrest, shaping not just her defense, but the prosecution's understanding of events. When Daniel saw the timeline laid out, he felt something unexpected: relief. Not because he was close to vindication, but because the doubt that had haunted him for years finally had an answer. He hadn't been blind. He had been outmaneuvered. Laura felt the pressure closing in. Invitations stopped coming. Donors asked questions. A journalist published a piece that didn't accuse her outright, but framed her success as remarkably well-timed. She read it 3 times, then tore the paper in half. That night, she drove past Daniel's motel. She didn't know why. Curiosity, maybe, or fear dressed up as concern. She parked across the street and watched the darkened windows. For a moment, she imagined knocking, reasserting control, reminding him who she was. She didn't. Instead, she went home and poured herself a drink, hands trembling just enough to spill a drop on the counter. Daniel, meanwhile, too, was learning the cost of reopening the past. Old acquaintances reached out not to apologize, but to ask questions that centered their own discomfort. Could he really blame them for believing his wife? Wasn't the evidence overwhelming? He answered politely. Briefly, he had no interest in relitigating his pain for their peace of mind. One afternoon, the public defender called him with a tone he hadn't heard before. They want a hearing, she said. A preliminary review. It's not an exoneration, but it's public. Daniel closed his eyes. Public meant exposure. For Laura, for the system, for everything that had been buried. Do it, he said. The hearing was scheduled for a month later. Laura's attorney urged caution. If this escalates, we pivot, he said. We don't defend the conviction. We defend your intent. My intent was survival, Laura snapped. And I succeeded. Yes, he said calmly. But now intent is exactly what they'll question. On the morning of the hearing, Daniel stood outside the courthouse again. This time, he wasn't alone. The public defender stood beside him. Steady, cameras gathered across the steps, reporters murmuring. Laura arrived through a private entrance. Inside, the room filled slowly. When Daniel took his seat, he felt the familiar weight of eyes on his back. He didn't look for Laura. He didn't need to. The judge opened the session with procedural language, then turned to the evidence. The investigator spoke first, laying out the patterns, the recovered data, the inconsistencies that no longer looked accidental. Laura's attorney objected. The judge overruled. For the first time since the trial, years ago, Daniel watched doubt enter the room. Not enough to free him yet, but enough to fracture certainty. When Laura was called to speak, she stood with practiced composure. She answered clearly, carefully. She denied nothing directly, but framed everything as coincidence, timing, misinterpretation. Then the investigator asked one final question. Can you explain why your consulting firm accessed documents related to your husband's accounts before charges were filed? Laura hesitated. Just a second. It was barely visible, but Daniel saw it. He saw the same hesitation he'd heard on the phone weeks earlier. Her answer came out smooth, but the crack remained. The judge adjourned the hearing without a ruling. More review was needed, more questions unanswered. Outside, cameras surged forward. Daniel said nothing. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. Laura walked past him without looking. But as she did, he saw it. Fear. Not of punishment yet, but of losing control of the story. And Daniel understood something vital in that moment. The trap she had built for him all those years ago was finally closing. Just not around the person she intended. The weeks after the hearing moved slower than Daniel expected, as if time itself were cautious now. Nothing exploded overnight. No dramatic arrests. No public apologies. Just quiet shifts. Small, deliberate movements beneath the surface that only someone watching closely could feel. Daniel watched everything. He kept his routine simple. Morning walks, meetings with the public defender, long afternoons reviewing documents, timelines, and notes he'd built over years of forced reflection. The motel room had begun to feel less like a hiding place and more like a command center. Every paper on the desk had a purpose. Every name circled in red meant leverage. Laura, on the other hand, unraveled in subtler ways. She stopped answering calls from certain numbers. Her assistant quit without explanation. A speaking engagement was canceled due to scheduling conflicts. None of it was fatal, but together, they formed a pressure that never let up. She had lived for years in control of optics. Now the camera angles were changing without her permission. One evening, Daniel received a message from the investigator. We found the intermediary. They met in a nondescript office the next morning. The investigator slid a file across the table, thin but dense with implication. A freelance financial consultant, he said. Paid through shell accounts. Disappeared 2 years ago. Recently resurfaced. Daniel scanned the name. He didn't recognize it. That was expected. He's scared, the investigator continued. And scared people talk. The consultant hadn't known Daniel personally. He hadn't needed to. His job was to route transactions, manipulate timelines, create plausible deniability. He claimed he was told the work was part of a divorce strategy, asset protection, risk mitigation. And Laura, Daniel asked. She was the client, the investigator said, but not the only one. She brought in legal backup early. Daniel leaned back, absorbing it. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was orchestration. The consultant agreed to testify quietly, conditionally. He wanted immunity. He wanted to disappear again once it was over. Daniel didn't blame him. Survival took many forms. The public defender cautioned restraint. "We need to be strategic," she said. "Push too hard, and she'll shut down." Daniel nodded. He'd learned patience the hard way. Laura called him that night. "You're enjoying this," she said, skipping pleasantries again. "No," Daniel replied. "I'm enduring it." "You could stop," she said quickly. "Too quickly. We could put this behind us. I could help you rebuild." Quietly, Daniel closed his eyes. The audacity still surprised him. "Help me rebuild what you destroyed," he asked. Her breath hitched. "I did what I had to do. For yourself," he said. "Not for survival. For comfort." Silence. Then, colder, "You're going to lose whatever sympathy you think you have." "I already lost everything," Daniel said. "I'm not afraid of losing nothing." He ended the call before she could respond. The second hearing was scheduled sooner than expected. New evidence had accelerated interest. This time, the room felt different, heavier, less certain. Laura arrived late. Daniel noticed the tightness in her posture, the way her gaze flicked briefly toward him before settling forward. She wasn't afraid of him. Not yet. She was afraid of exposure. The consultant testified via video. His voice shook at first, steadied by necessity. He explained his role, the payments, the instructions. He never accused Laura directly, but he didn't need to. The record spoke for him. Laura's attorney objected repeatedly. The judge allowed the testimony to stand. Then came the emails. Fragments, reconstructed. Not enough to tell a full story, but enough to show coordination. Intent, planning. Daniel watched Laura's hands. They were clenched now, nails pressing into her palm. When the judge recessed to deliberate, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Reporters typed furiously. A narrative was forming slowly, cautiously, but undeniably. Daniel sat still. He thought of his first night in prison, the concrete bench, the echo of distant shouts, the certainty that no one was coming to save him. He had saved himself. The judge returned and cleared his throat. "This court finds sufficient cause to reopen the conviction," he said. "Pending further review, the defendant's case will be re-examined in full." It wasn't freedom yet, but it was a fracture. Outside, microphones appeared again. This time, Daniel spoke. "I'm not here for revenge," he said evenly. "I'm here because the truth doesn't expire." Laura exited through a side door. That night, Daniel walked alone through the city, the air cool against his skin. He passed bars filled with laughter, couples arguing on sidewalks, strangers brushing past each other, unaware of the war, unfolding quietly in legal rooms and sealed files. For the first time, he felt something close to peace, not because it was over, but because it was finally moving in the right direction. His phone buzzed once more. An unknown number. He answered. "You should have taken the deal," Laura said. Her voice was stripped of warmth now. Only calculation remained. "I already did," Daniel replied. 5 years ago I paid for it." "You think this ends with me?" she asked. "You think they won't tear you apart again?" "They already tried," Daniel said. "I survived." The line went dead. Daniel slipped the phone back into his pocket and kept walking. He didn't look back, because, for the first time, since the handcuffs closed around his wrists, he knew this story no longer belonged to her. The full review moved forward with a weight that pressed on everyone involved. This time, the system didn't rush. It dissected. Every document Daniel had once been buried under was lifted again, examined under a harsher light. What once looked airtight now showed seams tiny, deliberate imperfections hidden beneath confidence and timing. Daniel spent long hours in conference rooms that smelled of old paper and burnt coffee. He answered the same questions again and again, not with desperation this time, but with calm precision. Dates, habits, routines. He no longer sounded like a man defending himself. He sounded like a witness describing something inevitable. Laura, meanwhile, was losing allies. Her attorney requested a private meeting with the prosecution, something that hadn't happened before. Board members quietly resigned. The consulting firm issued a statement distancing itself from individual decisions made without institutional oversight. The language was careful, legal, and unmistakably self-preserving. Daniel noticed something else too. People had started looking at him differently. Not with pity anymore, but with curiosity. Suspicion turned inward. The unspoken question shifted from, "What did he do?" to what was done to him. One afternoon, the public defender closed a folder and leaned back in her chair. "We're close," she said, "but there's still a gap." "What kind?" Daniel asked. "Intent," she replied. "We can show manipulation. We can show coordination. What we need is proof that she meant for you to go to prison." Daniel nodded slowly. "She did. I believe you," she said. "The court needs more than belief." That night, Daniel sat alone in his motel room, lights off, city glow bleeding in through the curtains. He replayed conversations from years ago, letting them surface without forcing them. Laura's voice, soft in the dark, the way she asked questions that felt like concern but were really inventory. The night she'd suggested he step away from managing the finances for his own peace of mind. Then it hit him. There was one thing Laura had always underestimated: her need to be understood. She didn't just want to win. She wanted acknowledgement, validation, someone to know how clever she was. Daniel reached for his phone. He didn't call her. He sent a message. "You always said no one ever really saw you." The reply came faster than expected. "Is that why you're doing this? To feel important again?" Daniel smiled faintly. "No," he typed. "I already know who you are. I was just wondering if anyone else does." Minutes passed. Then her response appeared. Longer this time. "You think you were innocent in all of this? You gave me everything. Access, trust, silence. You made it easy." Daniel's breath slowed. "I trusted my wife," he replied. "That's not a crime." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, reappeared. "It should have been enough for you to just disappear," she wrote. "But you never knew when to stop breathing." Daniel stared at the words. He forwarded the entire exchange to the public defender. The reaction was immediate. "This," she said later that day, voice tight with controlled excitement. "This is intent." The next hearing was no longer procedural. It was decisive. Laura took the stand again. This time, there was no performance. She spoke less, chose her words with caution, sharpened by fear. When confronted with the messages, she denied context, claimed emotional manipulation. Then the prosecutor read her own words aloud. "You made it easy." The room went still. Daniel didn't look at her. He watched the judge. For the first time, there was no neutrality in his expression, only focus. The ruling came 2 weeks later. The conviction was vacated. Wrongful conviction, prosecutorial reliance on manipulated evidence, failure of disclosure. Daniel stood when his name was called, knees unsteady, not from weakness, but from the sudden absence of a weight he'd carried for so long it had reshaped him. Laura was escorted out separately. Charges against her were pending: fraud, conspiracy, obstruction. Outside the courthouse, microphones surged again. This time, Daniel didn't step forward. He didn't need to. The story spoke for itself now. That evening, he returned to the motel for the last time. He packed quietly, leaving nothing behind. As he closed the door, he felt a strange gratitude for the room that had sheltered him during the storm. His phone buzzed once more. A voicemail. Laura's voice, stripped of polish. "You think this makes you whole," she said. "You think they'll see you as anything but the man who went to prison?" Daniel deleted the message without finishing it. He walked into the night, carrying nothing but what couldn't be taken from him anymore: truth and the quiet, irreversible knowledge that betrayal had failed to erase him. Freedom Daniel quickly learned, was not a celebration, it was an adjustment. The day after his conviction was officially vacated, he woke before dawn out of habit. His body still expected the clanging count, the shouted orders, the rigid schedule that had once dictated every breath. For a few seconds, panic flared, then faded, as he remembered where he was. Not a cell, a small rented apartment the public defender had helped him secure temporarily. A place with thin walls, mismatched furniture, and a window that looked out onto a narrow alley. It was his. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting on his knees, and let the silence exist without filling it. 5 years ago, silence had been dangerous. It invited thoughts that could drown a man. Now, it felt earned. Outside, the world reacted faster than he did. News outlets ran updates. Commentators debated systemic failure. Social media split neatly into outrage and amnesia. Some people apologized publicly for believing the story. Others said nothing at all, as if silence could erase their certainty from years before. Daniel didn't respond to any of it. He spent his days rebuilding in small, deliberate ways, opening a new bank account, replacing documents that had expired while he was inside, standing in line at a grocery store, overwhelmed by choice. Freedom was loud, too many options, too many directions. One afternoon, he caught his reflection in a storefront window and didn't recognize the man staring back. Older, leaner, eyes sharper but heavier. This version of him carried time differently. He began seeing a counselor at the suggestion of the public defender. Not because he thought he was broken, but because he knew survival skills didn't always translate into living. The sessions were quiet. The counselor asked questions without demanding answers. Daniel appreciated that. "Do you hate her?" she asked once. He thought carefully before responding. "No," he said. "I hate what I became while trying not to." That answer surprised him. Laura's situation moved in parallel but opposite directions. The more Daniel stabilized, the more her world collapsed. Charges were filed, assets frozen. Former allies distanced themselves with surgical precision. The consulting firm cooperated fully now. The same efficiency that had once protected her turned cold. Daniel followed the updates passively, like someone tracking weather in a city they no longer lived in. He felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only confirmation. One evening, as he sorted through mail, he found an envelope addressed in handwriting he hadn't seen in years. His mother. They hadn't spoken since the sentencing, not because she believed Laura, but because she couldn't bear the weight of watching her son disappear behind glass and steel. Her letter was short, careful, apologetic without explanation. "I didn't know how to reach you then. I hope I still can." Daniel folded the letter and held it for a long time before dialing the number she'd included. When she answered, her voice broke immediately. "I'm here," he said gently. "I'm not going anywhere." That call marked a different kind of return. Slower, messier, necessary. Weeks passed. Daniel was offered compensation eventually, a settlement, an acknowledgement wrapped in legal language. It would never return the years, but it would give him options. For the first time since his arrest, he allowed himself to think beyond survival. He started volunteering with a small advocacy group that worked with wrongfully convicted individuals. He didn't speak at events. He listened. He understood the silences others carried because they mirrored his own. One night, as he locked up the office, his phone rang. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Daniel," Laura said. Her voice was different, thinner, no polish left. "You shouldn't be calling me," he said calmly. "I know," she replied. "I just needed to hear you before everything ends." "It already has," Daniel said. She laughed weakly. "You always did think in absolutes." "I learned them," he said. In small rooms, there was a pause. Then, quieter. "Do you ever think about what we were?" Daniel closed his eyes. He thought of the wedding photo, the sunlight, the performance he'd mistaken for love. I think about who I thought you were, he said, and who I had to become after you showed me who you really were. Tears slipped into her voice. I didn't mean for it to go that far. That's the problem, Daniel replied. You meant for it to go at all. He ended the call and blocked the number. Not out of anger, out of finality. Months later, Daniel stood in a modest courtroom again. Not as a defendant, but as an observer. Laura was sentenced. The judge spoke of betrayal of trust, of calculated harm, of consequences long delayed. Daniel watched, without expression. When it was over, he stepped outside and breathed deeply. The air felt lighter, not because justice had been served, but because it no longer demanded anything from him. That night, Daniel returned home, cooked a simple meal, and sat by the window as the city settled into sleep. His life was not extraordinary. It was not dramatic. It was his. And for the first time since the morning, the sun had shone too brightly on his arrest. That was enough. Daniel thought the hardest part would be getting his life back. He was wrong. The hardest part was learning how to live in a world that had already decided who he was without asking him. Even with his name legally cleared, the shadow lingered. It followed him into job interviews that ended too politely. It hovered in conversations that grew awkward the moment his past surfaced. People smiled, nodded, reassured him that they understood, then quietly kept their distance. Innocence, he learned, did not automatically restore trust. It only removed the permission to openly despise. He didn't complain. He had survived worse than indifference. Instead, Daniel focused on control, the one thing prison had taught him to value above all else. Control over his time, his reactions, his future. He took contract work that required no background explanations. He kept his circle small. He woke early, ran long distances, and let the rhythm of his breathing anchor him to the present. At the advocacy group, he remained mostly invisible. He organized files, sat with families in waiting rooms, helped former inmates navigate paperwork no one had ever taught them to understand. He didn't tell his story unless asked directly. When he did, he stripped it of drama, facts only. The truth didn't need embellishment anymore. One afternoon, a young man approached him after a meeting, barely 20, eyes hollow in a way Daniel recognized immediately. How did you not lose your mind? The man asked. Daniel thought about the nights he had nearly done exactly that, the anger, the fantasies of confrontation that had burned hot and useless, the quiet decision, repeated daily, not to let hatred decide who he became. I almost did, Daniel said honestly. Then I realized surviving wasn't enough. I had to choose what kind of man walked out, not just when. The man nodded, absorbing that. That night, Daniel dreamed of Laura for the first time in months. Not the woman on the stand, not the voice on the phone, the version from years earlier, laughing in the kitchen, unaware of how easily love could become leverage. He woke unsettled, not because he missed her, but because the dream reminded him how thoroughly she had once occupied his inner world. Healing, he realized, was not forgetting. It was reclaiming mental space. Laura's sentencing made the news briefly, then vanished under the next cycle of outrage. 8 years, reduced for cooperation. The headlines framed it as accountability. Daniel read them once and moved on. He felt no closure in numbers. What changed him more was the letter that arrived 2 weeks later. No return address, prison mail. He didn't open it immediately. He let it sit on the counter, existing without power. When he finally did, the paper felt thinner than he expected. I don't expect forgiveness, Laura wrote. I don't even know if I expect to be remembered, but I need you to know this. I didn't destroy you because you were weak. I destroyed you because you were decent, and I needed to prove that decency could be erased. Daniel folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. He didn't feel anger. He felt clarity. That night, he walked the city until his legs ached. He passed the courthouse again, then kept going. Bridges, side streets, places where no one knew him. The city hummed around him, indifferent and alive. He understood then that his life would never return to what it had been. But it didn't have to. Weeks later, he was offered a full-time position with the advocacy group, not administrative, but strategic. They wanted his insight, his patience, his ability to see manipulation where others saw coincidence. For the first time, his pain translated into purpose. He accepted. The work was heavy. Cases piled up. Stories overlapped in ways that made his chest tighten. But unlike prison, this weight built something instead of eroding it. Each small win mattered. Each file closed felt like reclaiming a fragment of a system that had once failed him. One evening, after a long day, Daniel stood on his balcony and watched the city lights flicker on. He thought about the moment he'd walked out of prison and said, "Call her now," not as a threat, not as revenge, but as a declaration that he was no longer hiding from the truth. And that sentence had marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through contacts. Most were new. A few old names remained, quietly reclaimed. He stopped at one and smiled faintly. His mother. He called her, and they talked about nothing important. Dinner plans, weather, a neighbor's dog, normality, stitched back together one conversation at a time. When the call ended, Daniel leaned against the railing and closed his eyes. He had lost 5 years, but he had gained something rarer, the knowledge that even the most calculated betrayal could not define the rest of his story unless he allowed it to, and Daniel Cross no longer allowed anyone else to write his life for him. Time softened the sharpest edges, but it never erased them. Daniel learned that healing was less like closing a wound and more like building muscle around it. Strength formed where pain once lived. Months passed, then a year. The city changed seasons without asking his permission, and he changed with it. Quietly, at the advocacy group, his days filled with structure, he became the person others were sent to. When cases felt tangled or deceptive, he didn't rush conclusions. He asked questions that sounded simple but carried weight. He recognized patterns the way a musician recognized. Rhythm, small deviations that betrayed intention. Prosecutors respected him without fully understanding why. Judges listened longer when he spoke. Survivors trusted him because he didn't promise miracles. Trust was something he handled carefully now. There were moments, though, when the past reached out without warning. A familiar street corner, the smell of rain on hot pavement, a song drifting from an open car window that pulled him backward into a kitchen that no longer existed. On those days, he let the memories pass through him instead of fighting them. Resistance had taught him exhaustion. Acceptance taught him endurance. He began writing at night. Not a memoir, never that. Just fragments, observations, questions without answers. He wrote about how systems learned people's habits and used them. About how love could be weaponized through access. About how silence, when chosen, could be power instead of surrender. The pages stacked up, private and unpolished. He didn't know what they were for. He only knew they helped him breathe. One afternoon, he received an invitation to speak at a law school, a panel on wrongful convictions. He hesitated. Public speaking meant exposure. Exposure meant narratives he couldn't control. But the invitation wasn't framed around his story. It was framed around process, how cases fail, and how they can be repaired. He agreed. Standing at the podium weeks later, Daniel scanned the room. Young faces. Ambition mixed with certainty. He recognized that certainty. He had worn it once. "I'm not here to tell you what justice is," he said. "I'm here to tell you what it isn't." He spoke about assumptions, about shortcuts disguised as efficiency, about how credibility was often borrowed from proximity, not truth. He didn't mention Laura by name. He didn't need to. The lesson landed without spectacle. Afterward, a professor approached him. "You don't sound bitter," she said. Daniel considered that. "I am," he replied gently. "I just don't let it drive anymore." That night, he walked home under a sky heavy with clouds. His phone buzzed. A notification from the advocacy group, another case reopened, another family waiting. He smiled, small and private. Then, unexpectedly, the past arrived again. A request came through official channels. Laura wanted to transfer ownership of a property still tied to his name. A final administrative thread. Daniel stared at the document for a long time, feeling the old tension rise. Not anger, but vigilance. He consulted with counsel. Signed where required. No meeting. No messages exchanged. The transaction completed quietly, without drama. That was how he preferred it now. Days later, a second letter arrived. Different handwriting, same prison stamp. I don't ask for replies anymore. Laura wrote, but I need to say this. Once, without excuses, I mistook control for safety, and when control slipped, I chose destruction over humility. I thought if I broke you completely, no one would see what I was afraid of becoming. Daniel folded the letter and placed it with the others. He didn't respond. Forgiveness, he had learned, was not a performance. It didn't require acknowledgement. It didn't require reconciliation. Sometimes, it was simply the decision not to let another person occupy space rent-free inside your life. The following spring, Daniel moved. Not far, just enough to signal intention. A small place with more light. A desk by the window. A plant he remembered to water. He framed nothing on the walls, except a single photograph he'd taken himself. An empty road at dawn, stretching forward without promise or threat. One evening, as he cooked dinner, he caught himself humming. The sound startled him. He hadn't realized how long it had been since music had come unbidden. He sat down to eat and thought about the man he had been before the arrest. Earnest. Certain. A little naive. He didn't miss that man. He honored him. There was a difference. Later, as he prepared for bed, his phone buzzed with a message from a number he didn't recognize. This is Marcus from the panel. One of my students wants to volunteer. Says your words changed how she thinks about evidence. Daniel smiled and typed back a brief reply. Send her the orientation info. He set the phone down and turned off the light. In the darkness, he understood something fundamental. His life would always include what had been done to him, but it would not be organized around it. Betrayal had been a chapter, not the title. Injustice had shaped him, but it had not defined his direction. Daniel closed his eyes and slept without dreams. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like victory. The call came on an ordinary Tuesday. The kind that slipped between meetings and paperwork without ceremony. Daniel almost ignored it, assuming it was another scheduling update or a volunteer confirmation. When he answered, the voice on the other end carried a tension he recognized immediately. We've uncovered something, the investigator said. Something we didn't expect. Daniel closed his office door and sat down. Go on. It's not about Laura's case directly, the investigator continued. It's about how it was allowed to happen. There's evidence of a pattern, multiple convictions, same shortcuts, same consultants circling the same prosecutors. Your case wasn't an anomaly, it was a prototype. Daniel felt the old chill settle in. Not fear, but responsibility. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed shifted the ground beneath him. His pain had been used as a test run. They want you involved, the investigator said, not as a witness, as an advisor. Daniel exhaled slowly. The work he'd been doing mattered, but this was different. This was upstream, structural, dangerous. I'll help, he said, but not quietly. The review that followed unfolded behind closed doors at first. Data analysts mapped overlaps. Internal emails surfaced. Training materials revealed incentives that rewarded speed over scrutiny. The same consulting firm Laura had used appeared again and again, always adjacent, always insulated. Daniel spoke when asked, sparingly and precisely. He refused to speculate. He pointed to process failures, not villains. The effect was more unsettling than accusation. Systems hated mirrors. When word leaked, it leaked carefully. An investigative outlet published a piece framed as a review of prosecutorial efficiency. The subtext was unmistakable. Within days, officials denied wrongdoing while announcing task forces. The language was familiar to Daniel: defensive compliance. Laura's name appeared only once, buried halfway down the article. A footnote. Daniel noticed and felt something close to relief. Her power had always lived in the spotlight. In obscurity, she diminished. The pressure intensified. Whistleblowers emerged, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Daniel met them in small rooms and listened. He recognized the signs of fear, tempered by resolve. He never promised protection. He promised honesty. "You won't be heroes," he told them. "You'll be targets. Decide if that's worth it." Some walked away. Others stayed. At night, Daniel returned to his writing. The fragments became clearer, more deliberate. He wasn't telling his story anymore. He was outlining a map of how harm moved through institutions, how good intentions were bent by incentives, how trust was exploited at scale. He shared drafts with no one. The first formal reforms were announced 6 months later. Oversight boards, mandatory disclosure audits, independent review triggers. They were imperfect and overdue, but real. Daniel watched the press conference on mute, reading the captions without emotion. Change, he had learned, rarely looked like justice. It looked like inconvenience. The advocacy group expanded. Daniel trained new advisors, teaching them how to spot narrative traps and data illusions. He emphasized restraint. "Outrage is loud," he said. "Accuracy lasts." One evening, after a long day, he received a message from his mother. "I saw you on the news," she wrote. "You looked steady." He smiled and replied, "I am." Later that week, a final administrative notice arrived. Laura's appeal had been denied. The sentence stood. No further action required. Daniel read it once and filed it away without ceremony. He realized then that he no longer measured his days against hers. Their lives had diverged completely, connected only by paperwork and memory. That was as it should be. On a quiet Sunday morning, Daniel walked the empty road he had photographed months earlier. Dawn painted the sky in muted colors. He stood still, breathing in the cool air, and felt something settle in alignment between who he was and what he was doing. He wasn't chasing redemption. He wasn't correcting the past. He was building forward. When his phone buzzed, he answered without checking the screen. "Daniel," the public defender said, her voice warm. "They want you to lead the new review council." He closed his eyes, considering the weight of it, the visibility, the resistance, the inevitability of backlash. "Yes," he said finally, "on one condition. Name it." "We don't just fix what's broken," Daniel replied. "We publish how it broke, so it can't pretend it didn't." End quote. There was a pause. Then, approval. As the call ended, Daniel looked down the road again. It stretched on, uncertain and open. He didn't need to know where it led. For the first time, the future wasn't something to survive. It was something to shape. The first meeting of the review council took place in a room that smelled faintly of polish and old authority. Long table, neutral walls, faces carefully arranged into expressions of professionalism. Daniel recognized the posture immediately. People preparing to appear cooperative while guarding their ground. He took his seat without ceremony. There were prosecutors, policy advisors, retired judges, and 2 observers whose presence was never explained. The chair opened with a statement about transparency and progress. Daniel listened, hands folded, eyes steady. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't introduce himself with credentials. "I'm not here to punish anyone," he said. "I'm here to make repetition impossible." That sentence shifted the room. They began with metrics, clearance rates, conviction percentages, efficiency benchmarks. Daniel let them talk themselves into a corner. Then he asked a single question. What happens to a prosecutor who slows down a case because something feels wrong? Silence. Eventually, someone answered, "They fall behind." "And what happens when they fall behind?" They're reassigned, passed over. Daniel nodded. So speed is rewarded, doubt is penalized, and we're surprised when shortcuts become culture. No one argued. Over the following weeks, resistance took subtler forms. Delayed data, vague compliance, meetings rescheduled at the last minute. Daniel had expected this. Institutions didn't fight openly. They eroded momentum quietly. He countered by documenting everything. Minutes were published, votes recorded, disagreements noted without commentary. Sunlight, he'd learned, didn't need to burn to be effective. It only needed to stay on. Outside the council, his name began circulating again, this time not as a victim, but as a problem. An obstacle, a reminder. He received invitations framed as opportunities that were really attempts at soft influence. He declined them all politely. One evening, a former prosecutor requested a private conversation. They met at a cafe far from the courthouse. "You don't understand the pressure," the man said. "We didn't wake up wanting to destroy lives." "I know," Daniel replied. "That's why this keeps happening." The man frowned. "You think systems commit crimes. I think systems enable them," Daniel said, "and then call them mistakes." The man left without finishing his coffee. At home, Daniel felt the strain accumulate. Sleep became lighter, his runs grew longer. The work mattered, but it demanded a version of him that never fully relaxed. He noticed it and adjusted, scheduling silence as deliberately as meetings. One night, he returned to his writing and found himself drafting something new. Not analysis, not process. A letter, not to Laura, to the man he had been before prison. He didn't apologize to that man. He thanked him for trusting, for believing, for surviving long enough to become something else. When he finished, he folded the page and placed it in a drawer he rarely opened. 2 months into the council's work, the first real backlash arrived. An anonymous op-ed questioned Daniel's objectivity, suggested unresolved trauma, implied vendetta. The language was careful, but the intent was sharp. Daniel read it once and closed the browser. The next day, the council meeting was tense. "I won't recuse myself," Daniel said calmly when the question arose. "If lived experience disqualifies oversight, then expertise has no meaning." The motion died quietly. That evening, his mother called. "Are you tired?" she asked. "Yes," he said honestly. "Good," she replied. "That means you're doing something that matters." He smiled. The reforms advanced in increments: mandatory second reviews in complex cases, financial disclosures for consultants, randomized audits triggered by pattern recognition, not complaints. None of it dramatic, all of it effective. Then came the case that made everything real. A man in another state. Similar evidence structure. Same consulting pathways. Same rush to judgment. Daniel recognized the shape instantly. He pushed for review. Resistance followed. Then compliance. 3 weeks later, the conviction was overturned. The news spread fast this time. Daniel stood in the back of the press room, unseen, as the freed man spoke through tears. Families hugged. Cameras flashed. For a brief moment, justice looked like something you could point to. Daniel felt no pride, only resolve. That night, walking home, he passed a storefront where a television replayed an old clip, his own face, years younger, being led away in handcuffs. The screen cut to commentary. He didn't stop. He had seen enough mirrors. At home, he poured a glass of water and sat by the window. The city pulsed quietly, lives unfolding without awareness of the systems shaping them. He thought about the words he'd spoken at the gate years ago. Call her now. They had never been about Laura. They had been about refusing silence, about marking a moment when endurance became direction. Daniel finished his water and turned off the light. Tomorrow would bring another meeting, another file, another opportunity to push back against the quiet machinery that destroyed lives with paperwork and certainty. He would show up, not because he owed the past anything, but because the future was finally listening. The turning point didn't arrive with headlines or applause. It arrived in the form of an internal memo, dry, unassuming, circulated quietly among departments that rarely spoke to one another. Daniel read it twice, then a third time, absorbing what it meant rather than what it said. An independent oversight statute, permanent, enforceable, retroactive review authority. This wasn't reform theater. This was infrastructure. He felt it in the way meetings changed almost immediately. Less posturing, more preparation. People arrived with data instead of talking points, questions sharpened, excuses shortened. When Daniel spoke now, no one interrupted. The system had sensed something irreversible. That shift came at a cost. Pressure mounted from outside the council interest groups, political offices, donors who preferred efficiency to accuracy. Daniel's calendar filled with requests that sounded collaborative, but weren't. He declined most. For the rest, he listened without committing. "You're creating uncertainty," one official said during a private call. "No," Daniel replied calmly. "I'm documenting it. It was always there." At home, he noticed how differently he occupied space. He no longer flinched at sudden sounds. His shoulders rested lower. He slept deeper on nights when the work felt aligned, and lighter on nights when it didn't. He paid attention to that distinction. The advocacy group grew alongside the council's efforts. New volunteers arrived with fire in their voices. Daniel tempered it gently. "Anger is a spark," he told them. "It's not a fuel source. If you want this to last, you need discipline." He meant it for himself as much as for them. Then came the call that reframed everything. A federal review unit wanted his input off the record. A pattern had emerged across multiple states. Same consulting fingerprints, same narrative shortcuts, same outcome. Convictions that looked clean until someone asked the wrong question. "You were early," the agent said. "Before we knew what we were looking at." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Early meant exposed. It meant others had been caught after him because the system hadn't learned yet. "How many?" he asked. "Enough," the agent replied, "and growing." The work intensified. Daniel traveled more, listened more, spoke less publicly. He understood now that visibility was a tool, not a reward. He used it sparingly. One evening, after a long day of interviews, he returned to his apartment and found himself standing in the doorway, suddenly exhausted, not the bone-deep fatigue of prison, but the kind that followed purpose stretched thin. He sat at his desk and opened the drawer with the folded letter, the one he'd written to his former self. He didn't reread it, he just needed to know it was there. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "This is the attorney representing Laura." Daniel stared at the screen, pulse steady. "She wants to cooperate further," the message continued. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Daniel exhaled slowly. He forwarded the message to the council's legal liaison with a single line. "Proceed without me." He had learned where his presence mattered and where it didn't. The next months brought consequences that no single person could claim credit for. Convictions overturned, prosecutors disciplined quietly, consultants investigated openly. It wasn't sweeping. It wasn't cinematic. It was cumulative. One afternoon, Daniel stood in a hallway outside a courtroom as another man walked free, blinking in the sunlight. The man looked at him, recognition dawning, and nodded not in gratitude, but in understanding. Daniel returned the nod. That was enough. Late that night, Daniel walked alone through the city. He passed places that once triggered memory and found them muted now, stripped of power. He understood then that healing hadn't erased the past. It had recontextualized it. The pain was still there. It just no longer demanded center stage. At home, he cooked a simple meal and ate standing by the counter. Window open to the night air, he thought about Laura, not with anger, not with pity, but with distance. Her choices had set everything in motion, but they no longer defined the trajectory. His phone buzzed again, a message from the public defender. "They want you to speak tomorrow, Final vote, public session, Daniel typed back. I'll be there. The next day, the room was full. Cameras lined the walls. Reporters whispered. Daniel took his seat and waited. When the chair opened the floor, Daniel stood. I don't believe systems are evil, he said evenly. I believe they are powerful. And power without accountability doesn't need malice to cause harm. It just needs momentum. He paused, letting that settle. We can't undo every wrong, but we can remove the incentives that create them. And when we fail again as we will, we must fail transparently. The vote passed, unanimous. Applause broke out, brief and restrained. Daniel didn't join it. He sat down and folded his hands, feeling the strange quiet that followed completion. That evening, he walked home under a sky streaked with fading light. He stopped at a corner and watched traffic move, people heading toward dinners, arguments, reunions, futures, unmarked by his battles. He smiled faintly. The story that began with betrayal had ended in something else entirely. Not triumph, not revenge, but restoration. Not just of his name, but of his direction. Daniel crossed the street and kept walking. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it was honest. The day Daniel officially closed the file on his own case, there was no ceremony, no press release, no final handshake. He logged out of the system, shut down the encrypted drive, and slid the folder into an archive cabinet where it would remain untouched, unless someone else needed it. The click of the drawer sounded louder than it should have. He stood there for a moment, hand resting on cold metal, and felt something unfamiliar space. For years, his identity had been braided tightly with the case: survivor, advisor. The man who noticed patterns others ignored. Letting go of that file didn't mean abandoning the work. It meant acknowledging that this particular chapter no longer required his vigilance. That night, he walked home slower than usual, passing the long way through a neighborhood he rarely visited. Small restaurants hummed with quiet conversations. A bookstore glowed warmly through its front windows. A couple argued softly near a bus stop, then laughed, the tension dissolving as quickly as it formed. Life, uninterrupted. Daniel stopped outside the bookstore. He went in without thinking. Inside, the smell of paper and dust felt grounding. He wandered the aisles until a thin volume caught his eye. Essays on memory and justice. He flipped through it, reading lines at random. One sentence stopped him. We don't heal by correcting the past. We heal by refusing to let it repeat. He bought the book and carried it home like a small, private victory. The next morning, he woke with a decision already formed. Not dramatic, not reactive, just clear. He requested a leave of absence from the council. Not resignation, not retreat. Space. The chair responded quickly, with understanding and respect. The structures were in place now. Others could carry them forward. That, Daniel realized, was the point of doing the work properly, to make yourself unnecessary. He shifted his focus back to the advocacy group, but even there, he began stepping back from leadership. He trained replacements, documented processes, delegated authority. He watched with quiet satisfaction as others took ownership, made decisions, argued thoughtfully. One afternoon, a young volunteer asked him why he was pulling away. Daniel considered the question. Because if this only works when I'm here, he said, then I've failed. Outside of work, life began to open in small, unexpected ways. He accepted an invitation to dinner from a colleague, not to talk shop, but to eat, to sit, to exist. He laughed and was surprised by the sound of it. He reconnected with an old friend who admitted, awkwardly, that fear had kept them silent years ago. I don't need an explanation, Daniel said gently. I just need to know who you are now. They walked together after dinner, conversation easy, unburdened. That night, Daniel dreamed again, but this time, the dream wasn't of courtrooms or cells. He dreamed of walking down a long road with no destination in sight. The road wasn't empty, it was simply open. He woke, rested. Weeks later, a letter arrived from the state. Formal, brief, compensation finalized, case officially closed. Daniel read it once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer he rarely opened. Money, he knew, was a tool, not a salve. He used part of it to secure his mother's future, part to fund legal aid grants quietly, without his name attached. The rest he left untouched, unassigned, unhurried. One evening, as he sorted through old files to clear space, he came across Laura's last letter again. He read it this time, slowly. He didn't feel the need to respond. Instead, he placed it in an envelope, sealed it, and labeled it simply, "Finished." He didn't throw it away. He didn't frame it. He acknowledged it. On a quiet Saturday morning, Daniel drove out of the city alone. The road stretched ahead, pale under a sky still waking. He stopped at a lookout point, overlooking miles of open land, and stepped out of the car. The wind was cool, honest. He thought about the words he'd spoken years ago. Call her now, and understood their full meaning only then. They hadn't been about confrontation. They'd been about refusing to delay truth any longer. About choosing presence over fear. He stood there until the sun rose fully, then returned to the car and drove on. Not back to the city, but forward, toward somewhere new. Later that week, he signed the lease on a small house outside town. Modest, quiet, surrounded by trees. A place where nights were dark enough to see stars. On his first evening there, he sat on the porch and listened to insects, to distant wind, to the steady rhythm of his own breathing. He felt no urgency to fill the silence. His phone buzzed once, a message from the advocacy group. Another case reopened today. Thank you for everything. Daniel smiled and typed back, "You've got this." He set the phone down and leaned back, eyes on the darkening sky. The betrayal that had once defined his life now felt like a distant echo, not gone, but no longer loud enough to direct him. He hadn't just survived it, he had transformed it into something useful, then let it go, and as the stars appeared one by one, Daniel understood that this quiet, grounded, unremarkable peace was the freedom he'd been denied for so long. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of choice. The final confrontation did not happen in a courtroom or across a polished table or under the glare of cameras. It happened in a place stripped of symbolism, a small interview room inside the correctional facility, painted a color meant to discourage emotion. Daniel hadn't planned to go. He had already closed the file, sealed the letters, moved forward, but when the request came formal, regulated, time-limited, he understood why it mattered. Not for her. For him. He arrived early and sat alone, hands folded, posture relaxed. He wasn't bracing himself. He wasn't rehearsing lines. Whatever needed to be said would come on its own, or not at all. When Laura entered, escorted and subdued by routine, Daniel almost didn't recognize her. Not because prison had aged her, though it had, but because the posture was gone. No performance, no angles. Just a woman carrying the weight of choices that had finally landed. She sat across from him, eyes fixed on the table. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. Daniel nodded once. "You asked." She took a breath, then another. "I won't pretend this is about closure. I don't know if that exists. I just didn't want to disappear without saying this to your face." He waited. "I told myself for years that I did what I had to do," she continued, "that if I didn't control the outcome, I would lose everything. Somewhere, along the way, you stopped being a person and became an obstacle." Daniel absorbed that without reaction. He had heard variations of it before, from systems, from people who mistook momentum for necessity. "You were so calm," she said suddenly, looking up at him, "even when you came back. That scared me more than anger would have." "It wasn't calm," Daniel replied. "It was clarity," she swallowed. "I thought if I broke you completely, I'd never have to face what I was capable of. And now," he asked, "now I have nothing else to look at," she said. "No leverage, no narrative, Just the truth. Daniel leaned back slightly, considering her not as his former wife, not as his betrayer, but as a human being, finally stripped of control. The truth doesn't need you to admire it, he said. It just needs you to stop running from it. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Do you hate me? Daniel answered without hesitation. No. The words seemed to destabilize her, more than condemnation would have. I don't forgive what you did, he continued, and I don't carry it anymore. Those are different things. She nodded slowly, as if testing the weight of that distinction. I used to think power meant never being vulnerable, she said. Now I know it just meant I was afraid. Daniel stood. The time was nearly up. I didn't come here to punish you, he said. I came here to make sure the story ends where it should, with truth, not silence. She looked up at him one last time. I hope you live well, she said. I am, Daniel replied. He left without looking back. Outside, the air felt cleaner than he remembered. Not lighter, cleaner, as if something stale had finally been cleared out. That evening, Daniel returned to the house outside town. The porch light glowed softly as dusk settled in. He cooked dinner slowly, deliberately, savoring the ordinary motions, the sizzle of the pan, the rhythm of chopping, the quiet satisfaction of caring for himself without urgency. Later, he sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the stars emerge. He thought about the arc of everything that had brought him here. The betrayal, the prison years, the rebuilding, the fight to make sure what happened to him wouldn't keep happening to others. None of it felt wasted now. His phone buzzed with a message from the advocacy group. Another successful appeal. Another family reunited. He read it, smiled, and set the phone aside. The work continued. It didn't need him at the center anymore. Daniel leaned back and closed his eyes. He understood something with full certainty at last. The greatest cost of betrayal wasn't the years taken, or the reputation shattered, or even the pain endured. It was the temptation to let someone else's cruelty decide who you became afterward. He hadn't. The story that began with handcuffs and lies ended here, not with vengeance, not with applause, but with a man choosing peace without surrender, strength without bitterness, and truth without obsession. Daniel finished his tea, stood, and went inside. The door closed softly behind him, and for the first time, nothing from the past tried to follow. The last morning Daniel woke in the house outside town. Sunlight filtered through the trees and spilled softly across the floor. It was the kind of morning that once would have unsettled him, too quiet, too open, but now it felt earned. He moved through the space without thinking, muscle memory replaced by something gentler. Coffee, window, breath. He had no meetings scheduled, no calls waiting, no decisions that needed his immediate attention. That, more than anything, told him how far he had come. Daniel spent the morning sorting through the remaining boxes he'd never bothered to unpack. Old notebooks, case files reduced to summaries, photographs he didn't remember taking. Near the bottom of one box, he found the wedding photo, the one that had once hung in the living room. Smiling and immaculate, he studied it without flinching. The man in the photo looked open, earnest, untested. Daniel didn't pity him. He didn't resent him either. That man had loved honestly. In a world that rewarded calculation, there was no shame in that. Daniel slid the photo back into the box and closed it for the last time. By midday, he drove into the city for a final obligation, one he had chosen deliberately, a quiet lunch with the public defender, who had first taken his call when no one else would. They sat in a small restaurant away from the courthouse, the noise around them gentle and human. You know, she said halfway through the meal, you could have turned this into something else. A book deal, a campaign, a platform. Daniel smiled faintly. I know. Why didn't you? He considered the question. Because I didn't want my future to depend on my worst chapter. Its breath. She nodded, understanding. When they parted, Daniel didn't promise to stay in touch. He didn't need to. Some connections didn't require maintenance. They simply existed. That afternoon, he returned to the advocacy office one last time, not to work, but to clear his desk. It had already been reassigned. Someone new had filled the space with their own order, their own urgency. Daniel felt a quiet satisfaction, seeing that, as he left, a young volunteer called out to him, "Hey, before you go." He turned. "I just wanted to say, because of you, I don't look at the system the same way anymore." Daniel met her eyes. "Good," he said. "Never let it be invisible." The drive back took longer. He chose smaller roads, letting the scenery slow him down. Fields opened wide on either side, unbothered by outcomes or narratives. He realized then that the story he'd been living no longer felt unfinished. That evening, Daniel cooked dinner for himself and ate at the table. No distractions. He thought about the years he had lost, not with grief, but with precision. They had cost him comfort, trust, and time. But they had given him something rare, an unshakable understanding of who he was when everything else was stripped away. After dinner, he stepped outside as the sun dipped low, the sky burning briefly before settling into dusk. He breathed deeply and felt no pull backward. Inside, he opened his laptop and wrote one final page. Not analysis, not reflection, a conclusion. He wrote about how betrayal felt final, but wasn't. How justice was rarely dramatic, but mattered anyway. How healing didn't arrive as forgiveness or forgetting, but as the ability to choose again without fear. When he finished, he closed the file and deleted it. The story was complete. Later that night, Daniel stood by the window and looked out into the dark. Trees moving gently in the wind. He understood now that the moment he had said, "Call her now," wasn't the climax of his story. It was the pivot. The instant he refused to remain silent. The instant he stopped waiting for permission to reclaim his life. Laura had paid the price for her betrayal. The system had been forced to confront its failures, but the most important consequence belonged to Daniel himself. He had walked through injustice without becoming it. He turned off the light and went to bed, untroubled by memory, unburdened by outcome. Tomorrow would come, and whatever it brought, it would meet a man who knew exactly who he was. Betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from the person we trusted most, but it does not have to define the rest of our lives. Daniel's story is not about revenge or winning. It's about refusing to let injustice decide who you become afterward. Truth may take time. Healing may arrive quietly. Justice may never look the way we imagine, but dignity is always a choice, and once reclaimed, it cannot be taken again. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on where you are right now and what time it is for you. Share it in the comments. And if you believe stories like this matter, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next one.